The biting wind howled through the dimly lit streets as 12-year-old Jake Matthews trudged home from school, his thin hoodie barely shielding him from the winter chill. Snowflakes danced through the air, settling on his exposed hands as he stuffed them into his pockets, hoping to steal even a little warmth. His breath came out in small, misty clouds, and he shivered as the icy gusts cut through his clothes. Like, share, and subscribe, because this story proves that one small act of kindness can change a life forever. Jake's family had been struggling ever since his father lost his job at the factory. His mom worked double shifts as a waitress, doing her best to keep food on the table and the electricity running. Money was tight, so tight that when winter rolled around, there wasn't enough to buy Jake a new jacket. His old one had grown too small, and though his mom promised they'd get one soon, he knew better than to complain. As he walked down Main Street, his sneakers crunching against the fresh snow, Jake noticed a figure curled up against the wall of an old brick building. A man, wrapped in tattered blankets, his beard frosted with ice, sat motionless beside a shopping cart filled with scraps of belongings. Jake slowed his pace. He had seen homeless people before, but there was something different about this man. He wasn't holding a sign, wasn't asking for money. He just sat there, shivering, his hands clutched together for warmth. His face was pale, his lips chapped, and his eyes stared blankly ahead, as if he had already accepted his fate. Jake hesitated. His mom had always told him to be careful around strangers, but this man didn't look dangerous. He just looked defeated. The cold gnawed at Jake's fingers, and for a brief moment, he thought of just walking past, just going home to his warm bed and pretending he never saw him. But something inside him wouldn't let him. He knew what it felt like to be cold. He knew what it felt like to wish for something as simple as warmth. Without thinking, Jake unzipped his hoodie and shrugged it off, his teeth chattering the moment the wind hit his skin. His breath hitched, but he ignored it. He took a step forward and gently placed the hoodie over the man's shoulders. The man flinched at the sudden warmth, his eyes fluttering open in surprise. For the first time, he seemed to really see Jake. His lips trembled, but no words came out. His eyes, deep, tired, and filled with something Jake couldn't quite describe, welled up with tears. "Here," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not much, but it's warm." The man blinked, his rough, calloused hands slowly pulling the hoodie closer around him. You don't know what this means to me, son," he croaked, his voice raspy and weak. Jake gave a small, nervous smile. "It's okay." For a few seconds, they just looked at each other. The man's face softened, and he gave the faintest nod, an unspoken gratitude that said more than words ever could. Jake turned to leave, his body already numb from the cold. But as he did, the man called out, "Wait!" Jake paused, turning back. The man reached into the shopping cart beside him, rummaging through his few belongings before pulling out something small and carefully wrapped in cloth. His hands trembled as he held it out. "For you," he said. Jake hesitated before taking the bundle. The cloth was old and frayed, but inside was a small, polished stone, smooth to the touch and strangely warm despite the cold. A symbol was etched onto its surface, something Jake didn't recognize. "It's lucky," the man said. "Had it for years. Kept me going when I had nothing." He swallowed hard. "I want you to have it." Jake's fingers curled around the stone. Felt important, though he didn't know why. "Thank you," he said softly. The man gave a weak smile, then pulled the hoodie tighter around himself, already looking warmer than before. Jake turned and walked away, his arms wrapped around himself to fight the cold. He didn't know why, but as he clutched the stone in his pocket, he felt different, like something had shifted. That night, when he got home, his mother was waiting at the door. She frowned when she saw him without his hoodie. "Jake, where's your jacket?" she asked, concern in her voice. Jake hesitated, then sighed. "I gave it to someone who needed it more." His mom's expression softened, and after a moment, she pulled him into a tight hug. "That was kind, Jake," she whispered. He closed his eyes, the warmth of her embrace making him forget about the cold outside. What he didn't know was that this single act of kindness would change his life forever. The next morning, Jake woke up to the sound of loud knocking. It was urgent, almost impatient, rattling the thin wooden door of their small apartment. His mom, still in her robe, hurried to answer it, confusion etched across her tired face. When she pulled the door open, Jake blinked in surprise. A tall man in a tailored navy blue suit stood on their doorstep, his presence almost out of place in their run-down neighborhood. Behind him, a sleek black car idled by the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the morning light. The man's sharp blue eyes scanned the apartment before settling on Jake. "Is this the home of Jake Matthews?" he asked, his voice deep and composed. Jake's heart pounded. He had no idea who this man was or why he was here. His mother tensed, stepping slightly in front of him. "Who's asking?" she said cautiously. The man smiled, though it wasn't just any smile. It was the kind that rich people wore, the kind that made you feel like they knew something you didn't. "My name is Richard Lawson," he said, slipping a hand into his coat pocket and pulling out a business card. "I'm here because of something remarkable your son did last night." Jake's breath hitched. Last night? His mind raced back to the homeless man, to the cold night, to the jacket he had given away. His mom glanced at him before turning back to Richard. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand." Richard let out a small chuckle. "It's a little hard to explain at the door. May I come in?" Jake's mother hesitated. Their apartment wasn't exactly presentable. The wallpaper peeled at the corners. The couch sagged from years of use, and last night's dishes still sat in the sink. It wasn't a place meant for men who drove expensive cars and wore suits that cost more than their rent. Still, something about Richard didn't seem threatening. After a moment, she stepped aside. "Please, come in." Richard nodded, stepping inside carefully, his polished shoes clicking against the old wooden floor. His eyes scanned the small living room, but if he had any judgment about its condition, he didn't show it. Jake stood awkwardly, his hands in his pockets, fingers still wrapped around the strange stone the homeless man had given him. Richard turned to him, his sharp gaze softening. "Jake, do you know a man by the name of Thomas Reynolds?" Jake frowned. "No, I don't think so." Richard studied him for a moment before pulling out his phone. "Maybe this will jog your memory." He tapped the screen and a video began to play. Jake's eyes widened. It was security footage from a store's camera. The angle was slightly tilted, but he could see the street outside, the snow falling gently under the flickering streetlight. And there he was, a small, shivering boy taking off his only hoodie and draping it over the shoulders of an old homeless man. Jake felt his cheeks heat up. He hadn't done it for recognition. He had done it because it felt right. His mom gasped softly, bringing a hand to her mouth. "Jake!" Richard paused the video. "That man, Thomas Reynolds, is my father." Silence filled the room. Jake's heart skipped a beat. "Your father?" Richard nodded, his jaw tightening. "We've been looking for him for years. He disappeared after my mother passed away. No one knew where he was, and he refused any help we tried to give him." Jake's mind reeled. The homeless man, Thomas. Was this man's father? "I don't understand," Jake said slowly. "How did you find me?" Richard exhaled. "One of my employees saw this footage and recognized my father. When we traced the video, we found out who you were." Jake's mom, still processing everything, shook her head in disbelief. I don't know what to say." Richard smiled at her, then turned back to Jake. "You didn't just give a man a jacket last night. You gave my father a reason to believe in people again." Jake swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. Richard reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He handed it to Jake's mom. "This is for you." She hesitated before opening it, and gasped. Inside was a check. A check with more zeros than Jake had ever seen in his life. "I don't understand," his mom whispered, her hands shaking. "This is a gift," Richard said simply. "To thank you for raising a son with a heart big enough to change a life with a single act of kindness." Jake's mouth went dry. He looked at his mom, then back at Richard. "I didn't do it for money." Richard chuckled. I know, Jake. That's what makes you special. Jake's chest tightened. He thought back to the cold night, the way the homeless man's eyes had glistened with gratitude. He had only wanted to help. He had never expected anything in return. But now everything was changing, and he had no idea what was coming next. Jake sat frozen on the couch, staring at the check in his mom's trembling hands. The number printed on it seemed unreal, like something out of a dream or a movie. His mother, still in shock, looked up at Richard Lawson. This is too much. I can't accept this. Richard smiled gently. You don't have to decide right away. But please know that this is not a handout. It's a thank you. You and your son reminded my father that kindness still exists in this world. That's something money can't buy. Jake's mother swallowed hard, still unsure. Their family had been struggling for so long, working paycheck to paycheck, barely making ends meet. And now, out of nowhere, a stranger was offering them more money than she could ever imagine. Jake, however, was still stuck on something else. How is your father? Is he okay? Richard's expression softened. He's recovering. After your kindness that night, he agreed to let me take him to a shelter, and from there I got him into a private care facility. He's being looked after now. Jake let out a breath of relief. The image of the frail, shivering man on the cold streets had haunted him. Knowing that he was safe now made something inside him feel lighter. Richard studied Jake for a long moment, then leaned forward slightly. Jake, can I ask you something? Jake nodded hesitantly. If you could do anything, be anything, what would it be? Jake blinked, caught off guard by the question. He had never really thought about it. He had always been focused on just getting through the days, helping his mom where he could, making sure she didn't worry too much about him. I don't know, Jake admitted. I just want to help people, I guess. Richard's smile widened. That's a rare answer. He reached into his suit pocket again and pulled out another envelope, this one smaller than the first. He handed it directly to Jake. This, Richard said, is an opportunity. Jake exchanged a look with his mom before carefully opening the envelope. Inside was a single letter, printed on thick, expensive paper. As he read the words, his eyes widened. It was an invitation. To St. James Academy? Jake read aloud, his voice filled with disbelief. Richard nodded. It's one of the best private schools in the state. And if you're willing, I want to sponsor your education there. Full tuition, books, everything covered. Jake's mother gasped. What? Richard chuckled. Jake has already proven he has the kind of heart and character that makes a real difference in the world. I want to give him the tools to go even further. A good education, the right environment, it can change everything. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just a school. This was a future. His mom looked at Richard with tears in her eyes. I don't know what to say. Just say you'll consider it, Richard replied warmly. Jake stared at the letter, his mind racing. He had never imagined leaving his small public school, never imagined a life outside of this neighborhood. But now, for the first time, he could. And it all started with one act of kindness. Jake sat at the kitchen table, staring at the invitation to St. James Academy. The paper felt heavier than it should, like it carried the weight of a decision that could change his life forever. His mom sat across from him, still in shock. The check Richard had given her was still on the counter, untouched. It was more money than they had ever seen, yet it felt insignificant compared to what had just been offered to Jake. You don't have to do this if you don't want to, his mom said softly. I don't want you to feel pressured. Jake exhaled. It's not that, Mom. It's just, if I go to the school, everything changes. New people, a new place. I won't be here to help you as much. His mom reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Sweetheart, you don't have to worry about me. This is about you. This is about your future. Jake swallowed. He had never thought much about his future before. Life had always been about survival. Getting through each day, making sure his mom didn't stress too much, making sure they had enough to eat. But now, for the first time, he had a choice. Would he stay where things were familiar, or take a chance on something completely unknown? His thoughts were interrupted by another knock at the door. His mom exchanged a glance with him before getting up to answer it. When she pulled the door open, Jake was shocked to see the man from that cold night, the homeless man, Thomas Reynolds. But he didn't look the same. Gone were the tattered clothes, the layers of dirt and exhaustion. He was now dressed in clean slacks and a warm sweater, his face shaven, his hair neatly combed back. But his eyes, those same deep, tired eyes, still held the weight of something unspoken. Thomas smiled softly. "May I come in?" Jake's mother hesitated for only a second before stepping aside. "Of course." Thomas walked in slowly, looking around the small apartment before his gaze landed on Jake. "You're Jake," he said, his voice filled with warmth. Jake nodded. "Yes, sir." Thomas chuckled. "Sir. Haven't been called that in a long time." Jake smiled, but he could feel his pulse quicken. Why was Thomas here? The older man turned to Jake's mother. "I know you've already met my son, Richard. He told me what he offered Jake. I wanted to come here myself because I needed to say something." Jake and his mother exchanged a glance, unsure of what was coming next. Thomas took a deep breath. "I want you to know what your son did for me that night. I had lost everything. Not just my home, not just my family. I had lost hope. I had convinced myself that I didn't matter, that no one cared." His voice trembled slightly, but he continued. "But then, this boy, a stranger, took the only thing he had, a jacket keeping him warm, and gave it to me. Not because he had to. Not because he expected anything in return. He did it because he saw me, because he cared." Jake's chest tightened. He hadn't realized just how much that simple moment had meant to Thomas. Thomas turned to him, his eyes full of something deep and unspoken. "Jake, people spend their whole lives chasing money, success, power. But you already have something most people never find. A good heart." Jake swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled something out. A familiar object. Jake's breath caught in his throat. It was the small stone the old man had given him that night, the one he had carried in his pocket ever since. "I gave you this without explaining why," Thomas said. "It wasn't just some random rock. This was something my wife gave me before she passed. She told me it was a symbol, a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could create ripples we might never see." Jake's fingers curled around the stone. Thomas smiled. "And now, because of you, I've found my family again." He glanced at Jake's mother. "And because of you, your son has the chance to create even more ripples in this world." Jake's mother wiped at her eyes. "I don't know what to say." Thomas looked back at Jake. "I know this decision isn't easy, son, but let me tell you this, great things come from taking chances. If you go to that school, you won't just be changing your life. You'll be preparing yourself to change the lives of others." Jake stared down at the stone in his palm. He thought about all the people who had helped him, the teacher who had given him extra lunch when he was hungry, the neighbor who had watched him when his mom had to work late, and now Thomas and Richard, offering him an opportunity he never thought possible. Maybe it was his turn to take a leap of faith. He looked up, determination settling in his chest. "I'll do it," he said finally. "I'll go to St. James Academy." His mother let out a small, choked sob, half relief, half pride. Thomas grinned. "That's the spirit." Jake smiled back, clutching the stone tightly. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time he wasn't afraid of it. The days leading up to Jake's departure for St. James Academy felt surreal. His once simple life had transformed overnight, and he was still struggling to process it all. The uniform that had been delivered to him, a crisp blazer, polished shoes, and a tie he didn't quite know how to knot, felt like it belonged to someone else. His mother had cried when she saw him try it on for the first time. Not out of sadness, but pride. "You look like a young man with a bright future," she had whispered, smoothing the collar of his shirt. Jake still wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing. He wasn't just doing this for himself. He was doing it for his mother, for all the people who had helped him along the way, and most of all for Thomas Reynolds, the man who had once had nothing and now had his family back because of a single act of kindness. The morning of his departure, Richard arrived to pick them up. He insisted on driving them to the school himself, wanting to personally see Jake off. Before they got into the car, Jake turned to Thomas, who had come to say goodbye. The older man looked healthier now, standing taller, the weight of his past no longer crushing him. "You're going to do great things, kid," Thomas said with a proud smile. "And remember, no matter where life takes you, never lose that kindness in your heart. The world needs more people like you." Jake reached into his pocket and ran his fingers over the small, smooth stone Thomas had given him. It had become his reminder, his symbol of what one small act could do. "I won't forget," Jake promised. With one last look at his neighborhood, the streets he had known all his life, the home that had once felt too small but now felt like the foundation of something bigger, he climbed into Richard's car. As they drove away, his mother squeezed his hand. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. Jake smiled. "I think this is just the beginning." And as the city faded behind him and the gates of St. James Academy loomed ahead, Jake knew that his life would never be the same again. But no matter how far he went, he would never forget where it all started, with a jacket, a cold night, and a simple act of kindness.